This video is brought to you by Ground News. On Tuesday, American and Russian negotiators met in Saudi Arabia to discuss US-Russia relations and the war in Ukraine. A few hours after the meeting, Fox News reported that the two sides had provisionally agreed a three-stage plan that would culminate in a permanent peace agreement, but only after first a ceasefire and second fresh elections in Ukraine. This wasn't a total surprise. After all, it's something that Republicans and people on Trump's team have suggested in the past, but it hasn't gone down well with Ukraine or its European allies. So in this video, we're going to look at why this plan is so controversial, whether Ukraine will actually hold elections, and who would win. Do you kind of hate us? Well, watch us respond to your criticisms from bias to advertising and pronunciations in our dedicated criticism response video. It's linked in the description. So let's start with a bit of context. Ukrainian presidential elections are usually held every 5 years, in accordance with Article 103 of the Ukrainian Constitution. The last election was held on the 31st of March 2019, when Volodymyr Zelenskyy, then best known as a television personality, beat incumbent President Petro Poroshenko by a remarkably wide margin, winning 75% of the vote to Poroshenko's 25% in the second round runoff. Poroshenko was staunchly anti-Russian, having led Ukraine through the first phase of the war in Donbass, but his mixed record on both the economy and anti-corruption efforts meant he was far less popular than Zelenskyy, who ran as an anti-establishment outsider. Anyway, this meant that new elections were due for March or April 2024, but they were delayed because Ukraine has been under martial law since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, and Article 19 of Ukraine's On the Legal Regime of Martial Law bans presidential, parliamentary and local elections in these conditions. Aside from the fact that elections would be illegal, Zelenskyy and his allies argue that they just wouldn't make sense. Russia controls a significant amount of Ukrainian territory. Nearly 14 million Ukrainians have either fled abroad or been displaced internally, and an election risks dividing the country when it should be focused on fighting a war. Polling suggests most Ukrainians agree. Polling has consistently found that a majority of Ukrainians want elections to be postponed until after the war, and the most recent poll we could find, an IRI poll released in November 2024, found that 60% of Ukrainians either somewhat or strongly oppose holding new presidential elections, while just 36% support the idea. Anyway, Kyiv's decision to delay elections has become a popular talking point on Russian state media, which touts it as proof that Ukraine isn't really a democracy. But it's also sometimes been raised by more Ukraine-skeptic Western politicians like Republican Senator Lindsey Graham. It actually became a slightly more live issue in Ukrainian politics in late 2023, when Zelenskyy had a rather public falling out with the then Commander-in-Chief Valery Zelenskyy, who contradicted Zelenskyy by telling The Economist that the war had become, quote, a stalemate. Zelenskyy was actually ahead of Zelenskyy in the polls at the time, and his allies were pushing for elections, but Zelenskyy ultimately sacked Zelenskyy in February 2024 and sent him off to London to be the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK. Anyway, there was always a risk that the new Trump administration was going to push for elections. Trump's never had a great personal relationship with Zelenskyy, and in early February, Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, told reporters that in most democracies, elections take place even during wartime. The Kremlin quickly seconded Kellogg's sentiments, with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov claiming a few days later that President Zelenskyy's term of office has ended, and the, quote, legitimization of Ukraine's leadership, i.e. elections, would be necessary as part of any peace process. This seems to be one of the few things the US and Russia agreed upon in their recent meeting, and it was actually something Trump reiterated at his post-negotiations press conference in Mar-a-Lago on Tuesday afternoon, where he blamed Zelenskyy for starting the war, claimed falsely that Zelenskyy had a 4% approval rating, and again pushed for new elections. Both Trump and Russia presumably see Zelenskyy as an obstacle to peace. His relatively maximalist negotiating position, which includes Ukraine recovering all of its pre-2014 territory and ideally joining NATO, is pretty far from what Trump or Russia is apparently willing to countenance, while his international profile makes him hard to ignore. So, what happens next? Well, if Trump insists on elections, and if Russia agrees to a ceasefire in order to suspend martial law, then Zelenskyy might struggle to resist, given that Ukraine's survival still depends largely on America. Zelenskyy might also decide that elections are in his interest. If he can win another term, it'll be harder for the US and Russia to ignore him or dismiss him as unpopular. This is presumably why Polymarket currently suggests there's about a 70% chance that Ukraine calls elections before the end of this year. There's also some evidence that Zelenskyy accepts this is where things are headed. Earlier this month, Zelenskyy's office imposed sanctions on ex-President Poroshenko on grounds of, quote, national security. This sparked a furious backlash from Poroshenko, who described the move as politically motivated and claimed that he'd heard from someone inside Zelenskyy's office that they were preparing elections for October the 26th. So, if Ukraine were to hold elections, who would win? Well, the polls are irregular and somewhat unreliable, so should be taken with a pinch of salt. But all broadly suggest it would be a two-horse race between Zelenskyy and Zelenskyy, with Zelenskyy being the clear favourite. The most recent poll, for instance, from December last year, put Zelenskyy on 24% of the first preference votes, Zelenskyy on 36%, and no other candidate above 10%. This means a Zelenskyy-Zelenskyy runoff would be nearly inevitable, but that same poll found that Zelenskyy would win by a landslide, with 68% of the vote. But this would be, well, bad news for Trump and Russia, because Zelenskyy would probably be more likely to escalate against Russia than Zelenskyy. After all, one of the reasons Zelenskyy fell out with Zelenskyy was that he apparently wanted Ukraine to move to even more of a war footing by lowering the conscription age to find 500,000 more troops and prepare for a long war. While Zelenskyy did apparently push for an earlier withdrawal from Bakhmut, he also wanted a more ambitious counteroffensive in 2023. According to a recent book by Yaroslav Trofimov, the Wall Street Journal's chief foreign affairs correspondent, in 2023 Zelenskyy wanted to push south and cut off Crimea, but the US resisted, both because they thought it was too optimistic and risked provoking Russian escalation. This also raises the question, assuming they're aware of the polling, why are the US and Russia pushing for negotiations? Well, maybe they're trying to use the threat of elections to extract more concessions from Zelenskyy, or perhaps the Kremlin thinks that, even if Ukraine elects Zelenskyy, the infighting that could ensue would ultimately weaken Ukraine, giving Russia more power in negotiations. Nonetheless, the point we're trying to make is that elections could actually push Ukraine further from the Trump/Kremlin position, making a peace deal even less likely. Now that it's become such a partisan issue, especially in the US, figuring out what's actually going on in Ukraine can be really difficult. We're increasingly being flooded by misleading content, algorithmic feeds that just back up our biases, and reductions in fact-checking efforts. It almost feels like people are intentionally making it harder to get to the truth. One way you can cut through the noise is with Ground News, a website and app on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every day, Ground News ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. For example, here's the story we mentioned in this video about Trump's Ukraine envoy calling for elections earlier this month. Right away, you can see that the story had at least 98 outlets reporting on it. 21% lean left, while 52% lean right. Every story also comes with a detailed view of the bias distribution, factuality scores, and even specific ownership information, so you can see how reliable the reporting actually is. You can also swipe through some of the headlines to get a more detailed understanding of how reporting might change based on political bias, with right-leaning outlets generally being more critical of the practicalities of Kellogg's plan, and left-leaning ones focusing on the ethics of the US exerting influence over Ukraine's domestic politics. But my favourite part has to be their blind spot feed, which highlights stories that are being underreported on one side of the political spectrum or the other. This not only helps you redress your personal news bias by reading stories you might otherwise have missed, but also gives you a better perspective on how the media ecosystem is being manipulated and shifted to fit political objectives. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape. cutting through opinion and noise with a feed free from manipulation or algorithms. And I can't recommend it enough. In fact, if you subscribe today, you'll get 40% off their Vantage plan. That's under $5 a month for unlimited access to every incredible Ground News feature. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.